Reckonings are rarely punctual. In fact, they don't often happen at all. You can't expect all bad actors to receive karma for their wrongdoings. That's just not how the world works. But when the Reckoning does decide to make an appearance, they're almost never on time. No, the Reckoning likes to be fashionably late and doesn't usually arrive until well after the peak of hubris. The sea needs to recede far past what you'd expect, and only then can the wave gain the momentum it needs to wash all the trash back to its sender. In Ubisoft's case, they reached peak hubris years ago, back when they were greenlighting endless live service projects, yearly entries of the same 3 franchises, and modern military shooters that we literally could not tell apart, to say nothing of the allegations of misconduct, harassment, and abuse. This was back when we cared. We liked Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood, not to mention Black Flag, but we didn't want to see the franchise be ruined with careless sequels whose time and development was predicated more so on keeping the franchise's name in gaming media than in delivering a high-quality gaming experience. There was a time when Ubisoft showed us they could manage to make 3 completely different Tom Clancy's franchises, each with their own reason to exist and each with a unique multiplayer experience. So when those same experiences started to become homogenous and worse, they chased trends, we became weary and we complained to Ubisoft. We complained precisely because we cared. The opposite of love isn't hate after all, it's indifference. For some time we loved, and for a small window after we hated. But that window ran its course and we became indifferent. When Ubisoft announced a game that would aim to recapture the essence of one of the most beloved Assassin's Creeds, the most emotion we could muster up for it was a cautious hopefulness. By the time they released Star Wars Outlaws, we'd been burned too many times. Our wounds had already blistered and calloused, and our synapses seared a message into our brains. Don't believe their lies. Ubisoft's sin wasn't making bad games, far from it. The sin was simply a relentless willingness to peddle mediocrity. They aspired to sand off all the interesting edges of their video games in an effort to appeal to everyone. A fine endeavor, I suppose, but what happens when numerous tentpole franchises all seek to sand off all the interesting edges? Well, the lines begin to blur. This is so much worse than just making a game that doesn't resonate with everyone. A poorly received game that tries to do something new is an easily forgivable mistake. You can learn from it and come back better. Taking chances on novelty sometimes means missing the mark. Every visionary has missed the mark once or twice. That's what happens when you care enough to try. Ubisoft stopped caring enough to try, and eventually we stopped caring with them. And as a result, their reputation was cemented. Because trust is difficult to build and easy to lose. A bad reputation is lasting. I mean, look at EA. They're still considered the worst gaming company by far when they're really only the 3rd or 4th worst, if we're being honest. But the memories linger, and the calluses are a healthy reminder to put some space between you and the hot stove. Wait until the reviews are in. Wait until a patch. Wait until a discount. Wait until a deeper discount. First, the loyalty is gone and then the trust disappears. After that, the corporation loses its moat. It can no longer cushion the mistakes, and that's when the vultures prepare to feast on your dying corpse. At this point, it's been widely reported that Ubisoft's share price is in the gutter, dropping on a nearly daily basis at this point. Investors are fed up. They're calling for a change in leadership. They're calling for a buyout. They want the bleeding to stop. But what investors fail to realize is that Ubisoft's glory days, that was an exception. A perusal through their early library exposes that their start in game publishing was as uninspiring as their present day. If you think about Capcom, Atari, Namco, Taito, Midway, Activision, and Sega, you can find a rich history of gaming. Each of those publishers have sold retro compilations of 20 or more games spanning the 80s and 90s. In fact, many of those publishers have had multiple compilation packages for purchase over the decades. Search your memory banks for a single Ubisoft game before the year 1995, and I'd be impressed if you managed to think of one. From 1986 to 1995, Ubisoft released competent point-and-click adventure games, action-adventure games, and action platforming games. At the time, their name was stylized as two separate words, Ubisoft, or ubiquitous software. Ubiquitous as in being or seeming to be everywhere at the same time. This points more towards Ubisoft's motivations than anything else I've ever seen. They want to be everything and everywhere all at the same time. Back in these early days, they didn't specialize in any specific type of game or even a specific platform. Finally, in 1995, a young Michael Ansel spearheaded the design for a game called Rayman. It was a beautifully animated 2D side-scrolling platform. It was received well, though perhaps not revolutionary. Importantly, however, it marked the first big intellectual property for Ubisoft. Ubisoft would capitalize on the success with sequels, the first of which was Rayman 2: The Great Escape. That was a 3D platformer, released for Dreamcast, PlayStation, and Nintendo 64, among others. But Ubisoft's big break? That really came at the turn of the millennium as the result of two key acquisitions. Those acquisitions would serve as the foundation for the golden years of Ubisoft. In August of the year 2000, Ubisoft acquired Red Storm and with it the right to the Tom Clancy's branding. The brand prospered in Ubi's hands with three key franchises: Rainbow Six, Ghost Recon, and Splinter Cell. The brand was cohesive in theme, but each franchise was distinct. Rainbow Six focused on SWAT-style tactical combat. Firefights primarily occurred indoors within tight corridors. The tactical combat in Ghost Recon, on the other hand, was inspired by militaristic scenarios and placed emphasis on long-range combat. You could even call in support from helicopters and tanks. Finally, Splinter Cell put you in the shoes of a highly trained Black Ops agent, Sam Fisher. The exploits you took on behalf of the protagonist were akin to Jack Bauer from 24 or Mission Impossible's Ethan Hunt. This triumvirate of franchises would be foundational to Ubisoft's success in the PS3 360 generation, where people craved online multiplayer experiences and realistic military campaigns. But just as they wrapped up the acquisition of Red Storm in 2000, Ubi proved they had another coup up their sleeves as they acquired the rights to Prince of Persia in 2001. Spanning from the original classic in 1989, the rights to Prince of Persia had been transferred from Broderbund to the Learning Company to Mattel Interactive and finally to Ubisoft. Within 2.5 years, Ubisoft and the designer of the original Prince of Persia, Jordan Mechner, had completed a successful reimagining of the classic title with Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. It was innovative for the ability to rewind and undo your mistakes in-game. Sands of Time had great reception both from fans of the original and those who were less familiar with the franchise. Sequels to the reboot did not involve the original designer, Jordan Mechner. Perhaps as a result of that, the series did stumble a bit. The immediate sequel, The Warrior Within, was too much of a departure for many. Ubisoft managed a return to form with their follow-up, Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones. It was at this point, however, that the series took a break. During its hiatus, a spiritual successor would be conceived that would form the shape of Ubisoft's titles for years to come. The first Assassin's Creed game showed promise but was criticized for its repetitive gameplay. Assassin's Creed 2 refined the formula and realized the promise of the original. Ubisoft saw that success and struck while the iron was hot, releasing 8 new Assassin's Creed titles over the next 8 years. Finally slowing down in 2018 to a once every 2 years cadence. Aside from those acquisitions, there was one more brand that was formative to Ubi's golden years. In 2004, they published a Crytek-developed title, Far Cry. The follow-up, Far Cry 2, didn't come until 2008, and this time it didn't involve Crytek at all, with Ubi preferring to lean on their in-house studio, Ubisoft Montreal. Led by Clint Hocking, Far Cry 2 was praised for its approach to realism and the player freedom within its open world. The game was somewhat hostile to the player. There was a weapon durability system that would eventually render your firearm unusable. Far Cry 2 also employed a malaria mechanic where the player would get sick every 30 to 40 real-life minutes. The protagonist's actions would be limited until eventually you were incapacitated unless you took the needed medications. These hostile elements were removed in Far Cry 3, and the overall world was made to be more interactive and lively. The result was tremendous success for Ubisoft, cementing the franchise's future as one of the tentpoles of Ubi's stable. Each of these successes proved that there are creative visionaries and talented teams within Ubisoft, people that at one point were allowed to make mistakes and later refine their formula into something successful. But at the end of the day, all of that took a backseat to business. Business ran these franchises into the ground and made Ubisoft financially vulnerable. Vivendi attempted a hostile takeover in 2015. Some employees at Ubisoft faced accusations of sexual misconduct in 2020. Overall, sales started to slow, and by late 2022, Tencent owned 49.9% of Ubisoft. Ubi's shares had already been in decline at this point, and it only continued from there up to where we are today. They invented new terms to explain their ballooning budgets, they shifted responsibility to anyone they could, and they failed to protect their employees. All told, they insisted on having a disconnected, bordering on hostile view of gaming as a whole. After the sales of Star Wars Outlaws proved to be softer than expected, executive Yves Guillemot said to his employees, quote, "In today's ultra-competitive market, players expect extraordinary experiences and ultra-polished games on day one. We need to continue to improve when it comes to fine-tuning our games and delivering outstanding gameplay." End quote. This is a damning admission that Ubisoft has knowingly delivered less than polished experiences on day one with the expectation that players will just deal with it. It's an admission that they didn't need extraordinary experiences, they thought they could get away with ordinary experiences. Guillemot is not only late to the party, he may no longer be welcome. He's facing a turmoil with shareholders demanding Ubisoft go private and replace him as head of the corporation. Simultaneously, Ubisoft has long lost trust from gamers. They don't have the loyal fan base that Capcom or Sega has, and they are now seen as hostile to gamers themselves. It may be that there's no happy ending to this story. After all, that's not what a reckoning is. A reckoning is simply a settlement of accounts. And the time may have finally come for Ubisoft to settle up, but they've wormed their way out of trouble before. Can they get out of this intact? Will we ever see a return to form for beloved franchises? Do we even care? I don't have the answers to these questions, but maybe you do.